There is a metal sitting in a vault somewhere beneath the streets of Manhattan right now, sitting in the dark, in silence, in a room with walls made of steel and doors that weigh more than most cars, and guards who have never once in their careers needed to use their weapons because nobody has ever successfully stolen what is inside. It has been sitting there for decades. Some of it has been sitting in one form or another for centuries. It does not rust. It does not corrode. It does not change. It looks exactly the same today as it did the day it was put there. And it looked exactly the same on that day as it did 1,000 years before that, and 1,000 years before that, and 1,000 years before that. It is the same metal that Cleopatra wore around her neck, the same metal that filled the temples of the Aztecs when Spanish soldiers arrived and could not believe what they were seeing. The same metal that drove men insane in the mountains of California in 1849, that caused wars and toppled empires and crossed oceans and rewrote the maps of entire continents. The same metal that NASA coated onto the visors of astronaut helmets because nothing else reflected radiation as perfectly, meaning that the first human beings to walk on the moon saw the lunar surface through a thin film of it. The same metal that has been found in the tombs of kings dead for 5,000 years, still gleaming, still perfect, as if time itself had agreed to leave it alone. Gold. You already know what it is. You have seen it, probably worn it, or wanted it, or thought about it in the particular way that humans think about things that represent something beyond their physical reality. Every human culture that has ever existed on this planet, without exception, has assigned this metal a meaning that goes far beyond its chemical properties. Every civilization, every empire, every religion, every economic system has found in this soft yellow metal something that seemed to reflect the deepest human ideas about value and permanence and beauty and power. The question is, why? Why this metal? Why not iron, which is far more useful? Why not copper, which is far more common? Why not silicon, which is the foundation of the modern world? Why, out of all the elements in the periodic table, out of all the substances that exist on this planet, did human beings across every culture and every era independently arrive at the same conclusion? That this particular soft yellow metal was worth more than almost anything else. The answer to that question is a story that begins not on Earth, but in space, not in human history, but before human history. A story that runs from the collision of neutron stars billions of years ago, to the vaults beneath Manhattan, to the smartphones in our pockets, to wars being fought right now over territory whose value is calculated, ultimately, in gold. And it is a story about something deeper than money, deeper than economics, a story about what human beings are, about what we need and what we fear, and what we reach for when we are trying to hold on to something in a world where almost everything eventually disappears. Gold does not disappear. That is where everything begins. Gold was not made on Earth. Not a single atom of it. Not the gold in your jewelry, not the gold in the vaults of central banks, not the gold in the Olympic medals, not the gold leaf on the domes of cathedrals. None of it was made here. Every atom of gold on this planet arrived from somewhere else, carried here by forces so violent and so ancient that the numbers required to describe them stop feeling like mathematics and start feeling like mythology. To understand where gold comes from, you need to understand something about stars. Stars are engines. Enormous, sustained nuclear explosions held together by their own gravity, fusing lighter elements into heavier ones and releasing energy in quantities that make every other energy source in the universe look trivial. A star begins with hydrogen. It fuses hydrogen into helium. When the hydrogen runs low, it begins fusing helium into carbon, then carbon into oxygen, then oxygen into neon, into magnesium, into silicon, into iron. And then it stops. Iron is the end of the road for stellar fusion. Fusing elements lighter than iron releases energy. Fusing elements heavier than iron requires energy. A star that has built up an iron core has reached the limit of what it can do. The core, no longer generating the outward pressure of nuclear fusion, collapses under gravity in a fraction of a second. The outer layers of the star, suddenly unsupported, fall inward and then rebound in an explosion of almost incomprehensible violence. A supernova. For a few weeks, a supernova can outshine an entire galaxy. It releases more energy in those weeks than our sun will release in its entire 10 billion year lifetime. And in the extreme conditions of that explosion, temperatures and pressures so far beyond anything achievable in a laboratory that they exist nowhere else in the universe, elements heavier than iron are forged. Silver, platinum, uranium, gold. But supernovae alone may not fully account for the gold in the universe. The quantities produced in stellar explosions, while enormous by any human measure, may not be sufficient to explain how much gold exists. In 2017, astronomers detected, for the first time, the gravitational waves produced by the collision of two neutron stars. Neutron stars are the collapsed remnants of massive stars. Objects so dense that a teaspoon of their material would weigh 1 billion tons. When two of them collide, the event is called a kilonova. And the kilonova detected in 2017 produced, in a fraction of a second, an amount of gold equal to several times the mass of the Earth. Your wedding ring, if you are wearing one, may contain atoms forged in the collision of two dead stars billions of years ago. The gold that eventually arrived on Earth came here in the early bombardment. The same rain of asteroids and comets that brought water to the early Earth brought heavy metals too, including gold, delivered in the bodies of metal-rich asteroids striking the young planet during the first few 100 million years of its existence. Some of that gold sank deep into the Earth's interior during the period when the planet was still largely molten, drawn down toward the iron core by its own density. The gold in the Earth's core is, by some estimates, enough to cover the entire surface of the planet in a layer 4 meters deep. Unreachable. Gone. Locked inside the planet forever. The gold accessible at or near the Earth's surface. The gold that human beings have been finding and fighting over and obsessing about for 10,000 years is a relatively small residue. The gold that arrived late in the bombardment, after the Earth's surface had cooled enough that the metal could not sink to the core. The gold that was later concentrated by geological processes, by hydrothermal fluids moving through cracks in the rock and depositing metal as they cooled, by the erosion of gold-bearing rock over millions of years and the concentration of the heavy metal particles in riverbeds and alluvial deposits. Gold is heavy, much heavier than the rock and sand it is typically mixed with. 43 times the weight of an equal volume of water. This density is both a physical property and the first clue to understanding why humans found it. When rivers carry eroded material downstream and the current slows, the heaviest particles settle first. Gold settles to the bottom of streams and accumulates in the bends of rivers and in cracks in bedrock, concentrated by nothing more than gravity over thousands of years into the placer deposits that the first gold hunters found. It sits there, in the riverbed, waiting, gleaming. That gleam is not accidental. It is a direct consequence of gold's electronic structure, of the way its electrons absorb and reflect light. Most metals appear grey or silver because they reflect all visible wavelengths of light roughly equally. Gold is different. Its electrons, influenced by relativistic effects that require quantum physics to fully explain, absorb blue light and reflect red and yellow wavelengths preferentially. The warm yellow color of gold is a quantum mechanical phenomenon, a consequence of Einstein's theory of relativity operating at the level of individual electrons. Gold is beautiful because of relativity. And that beauty, combined with its extraordinary resistance to corrosion, its softness that made it workable with the primitive tools of the ancient world, and its presence in accessible alluvial deposits in river systems across many parts of the world, meant that it was almost inevitable that human beings would find it, would pick it up, would feel its weight and see its color, and decide that it was special. The first humans to find gold did not know about neutron stars. They did not know about supernovae, or electron configurations, or relativistic quantum mechanics. They knew only what their senses told them, that this thing was different, that this thing did not rust or tarnish or crumble, that it caught the light in a way that nothing else did, that it could be shaped and worked without fire, without the sophisticated metallurgy that other metals required, using only the simplest tools and the pressure of human hands. That it was beautiful in a way that felt, though they would not have used this word, permanent. Permanence. That is the quality that gold has that no other substance quite matches.
Iron rusts, wood rots, stone erodes, cloth decays. Every material that human beings have ever used to build or make or decorate eventually returns to the earth in one form or another. Gold does not. Gold found in Egyptian tombs sealed 4,000 years ago looks the same today as the day it was placed there. Gold recovered from shipwrecks on the ocean floor, lying in salt water for 500 years, comes up gleaming. The gold atoms in a Roman coin minted 2,000 years ago are identical to the gold atoms in a bar sitting in Fort Knox today. Nothing changes it. Nothing diminishes it. Nothing takes it away. For a species that was acutely aware of its own mortality, that buried its dead and mourned its losses, and told stories about what might persist after death, a substance that seemed to exist outside the normal rules of decay and impermanence was not just valuable. It was almost sacred. The first gold objects made by human hands date to approximately 6,000 years ago in what is now Bulgaria. Small beads and ornaments found in a burial site called the Varna Necropolis, the oldest worked gold objects ever discovered. They were placed in the grave of a person of high status, a person the community wanted to honor and commemorate. And they sat in the darkness of that grave for 6,000 years without changing. They are still gold. They will always be gold. And that, more than any economic theory or monetary system or industrial application, is the foundation of everything that gold has meant to human beings across every culture and every era. Not its rarity, though it is rare. Not its utility, though it has utility. Not its conductivity or its malleability or any of its technical properties. Its permanence. Its refusal to become something less than what it is. In a world where everything ends, gold does not end. And human beings, who have always known that they will end, have never stopped reaching for it. The Egyptians did not think gold was valuable. They thought it was divine. This is not a metaphor, not a poetic way of describing how much they liked it. The ancient Egyptians, with the literal and systematic thoroughness that characterized their entire relationship with the supernatural, believed that gold was the flesh of the gods. Specifically, the flesh of Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon, whose body was made of gold, and whose bones were made of silver, and whose hair was made of lapis lazuli. When you touched gold, you were touching something that had come from outside the human world entirely, something that belonged to a category of existence above and beyond the mortal. This belief had practical consequences of extraordinary scale. The pharaohs of ancient Egypt controlled one of the richest gold-producing regions in the ancient world. The eastern desert between the Nile and the Red Sea, and the region of Nubia to the south, contained gold deposits of enormous extent and accessibility. The Egyptians mined them with a thoroughness and a brutality that left marks still visible in the landscape today.
tunnels cut into rock faces in temperatures that regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius, worked by prisoners of war and condemned criminals and enslaved people who died in such numbers that the ancient sources described the mining regions as places from which no one returned. The gold they extracted went to the pharaoh, all of it, because the pharaoh was himself divine, the living embodiment of Horus and the earthly representative of Ra, and the flesh of the gods belonged to the gods and therefore to their representative on earth. Gold in ancient Egypt was not money in any sense we would recognize. It did not circulate in the economy. Ordinary Egyptians conducted their transactions in grain and linen and beer and the other commodities of daily life.
Gold existed in a separate realm entirely, the realm of the sacred and the royal, and its movement was controlled with an absolute authority that no subsequent government has quite managed to replicate. The tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered by Howard Carter in 1922 in the Valley of the Kings, contained over 5,000 gold objects. Tutankhamun was a minor pharaoh. He died young, probably in his late teens, and his reign was brief and historically unremarkable. If a minor pharaoh of limited importance was buried with 5,000 gold objects, the tombs of the great pharaohs, Ramesses II, Thutmose III, Amenhotep III, must have contained quantities of gold that would stagger the imagination. We will never know exactly how much, because those tombs were robbed in antiquity, most of them within a few centuries of the burial, by people who understood perfectly well that the divine flesh of the gods had a very practical value in the human world. The gold mask of Tutankhamun weighs 10 kilograms. It was placed directly over the face of the mummified king because the Egyptians believed that in death the pharaoh became Osiris, god of the underworld, and that his face should therefore be made of the material appropriate to a divine being. For 3,000 years, that mask sat in the darkness of a sealed tomb, covering the face of a dead boy, waiting. When Carter broke the seal of the inner chamber and held up his candle and looked inside, he saw the gleam of gold in every direction. His colleague, Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked if he could see anything. Carter's answer has become one of the most famous sentences in the history of archaeology. "Yes," he said, "wonderful things. All of it gold, all of it unchanged, all of it exactly as it had been placed 3,300 years earlier. Because gold does not change, because gold was never going to change, because that was the entire point." But Egypt was not alone in understanding gold this way.
Across the ancient world, independently and without contact with each other, civilizations were arriving at the same conclusion: that gold was not simply a material, that it was a bridge between the human and the divine, that its permanence reflected something about the nature of the sacred that no other substance could capture. In ancient Mesopotamia, the ziggurats, the great stepped temple towers of Sumer and Babylon, were decorated at their peaks with gold leaf and golden ornaments that caught the sunlight and could be seen for miles across the flat alluvial plain. The gods lived at the top of the ziggurat, and the gods required gold because gold was what the divine was made of. The priests who served in these temples wore gold. The cult statues of the gods were covered in gold. The ritual vessels used in religious ceremonies were gold. In ancient India, gold was associated with Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth and prosperity, and with Agni, the god of fire, and with the sun itself. The Vedic texts describe the gods as golden-limbed and golden-haired and golden-eyed. The ritual fires of Vedic religion were fed with offerings that included gold, returning the divine metal to the divine realm through the medium of flame. In ancient China, gold was associated with the heavens and with imperial authority. The emperor, the son of heaven, wore yellow robes whose color referenced gold and the sun, and the divine mandate that justified his rule. The imperial seal was gold. The imperial palace was decorated with gold. The connection between gold and legitimate heavenly authority was so deeply embedded in Chinese political culture that it persisted in various forms for thousands of years. In the pre-Columbian Americas, civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from the Old World arrived at remarkably similar conclusions.
The Aztecs called gold Teoquitlatl, which translates approximately as excrement of the gods, a phrase that sounds disrespectful until you understand that in Aztec religious thought, the excrement of the gods was not a contemptible thing, but a sacred emanation of divine being, a substance that partook of the nature of the divine in the most direct possible way. The Incas called gold the sweat of the sun. Their temples were lined with gold panels and gold figurines and gold vessels, not because gold was wealth in an economic sense, but because the temple was the house of the sun god Inti, and the house of the sun should be made of the sun's own substance. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the early 16th century and saw these temples for the first time, they did not understand any of this. They did not understand the theology or the cosmology or the centuries of cultural development that had produced the decision to cover the walls of a temple in gold. They understood only that there was an enormous quantity of a metal that was worth a great deal in the world they came from, and they proceeded to remove it with a thoroughness and a violence that permanently altered the history of 2 continents. But we are moving ahead of ourselves. The ancient world's relationship with gold was complicated by a development that began sometime around 700 BCE in the kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey. A development that transformed gold from a sacred substance reserved for gods and kings into something that could, in principle, belong to anyone. The Lydians invented coinage, not the use of gold as a medium of exchange, which had been happening in various forms for centuries, but the stamping of a standardized mark on a piece of metal of guaranteed weight and purity, creating an object whose value was certified by the authority of the state, and therefore did not need to be weighed and tested every time it changed hands. The first coins were made of electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver found in the riverbeds of the region. They were stamped with the image of a lion, the symbol of the Lydian royal house, and they circulated through the markets of the ancient Near East with a speed and a reach that no previous form of money had achieved. Money had been invented before. Grain and cattle and shells and copper rings and clay tablets recording debts had all served as media of exchange in various times and places. But coined metal, portable and durable and standardized and guaranteed, was something new. It was the first form of money that could move easily across political boundaries, that could be carried in a pocket, that could accumulate in quantities that represented not just present wealth, but future possibility. The Lydian king Croesus, who refined the technology by producing pure gold and pure silver coins separately rather than the mixed electrum of his predecessors, became so wealthy that his name became a byword for riches that has lasted 2,500 years. As rich as Croesus. We still say it. The man has been dead for 25 centuries, and his name still means the same thing it meant when he was alive. That is what gold does to reputations. That is what gold does to history. It makes things last.
Rome ran on gold. Not metaphorically. Not in the abstract sense that modern economists use when they talk about the relationship between monetary systems and imperial power. Literally. The Roman Empire was a machine for extracting gold from the territories it conquered and concentrating it at the center. And when the gold stopped flowing, the machine began to break down in ways that no amount of military genius or administrative reform could fully compensate for. The Romans understood this about themselves with unusual clarity. The historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, complained that Rome was hemorrhaging gold to the east, to India and Arabia and China, in exchange for spices and silk and luxury goods, and that this outflow was draining the empire of the substance that held it together. He calculated, with the imprecise but directionally accurate accounting of ancient economic analysis, that Rome was sending 100 million sesterces east every year, and getting back nothing that could be used to pay soldiers or build roads, or maintain the infrastructure of a civilization that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia. He was describing, without having the conceptual vocabulary for it, a balance of payments crisis. But before the crisis, there was the glory. The Roman relationship with gold began, as so many Roman things began, with conquest. The gold of Carthage, captured after the destruction of that city in 146 BCE. The gold of Macedonia and Greece, stripped from the temples and treasuries of the Hellenistic world during the Roman expansion eastward. The gold of Gaul, where Julius Caesar's campaigns produced enough plunder to temporarily flood the Roman market and drive down the price of gold by 25%. The gold of Egypt, the richest prize of all, which fell to Rome when Octavian defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BCE, and the accumulated wealth of the Ptolemaic dynasty became Roman property overnight. Cleopatra's gold. The last gold of the last pharaoh.
carried to Rome in Octavian's triumph, displayed to the crowds lining the streets of the city, then melted down and recast as Roman coins bearing Roman images. The final transformation of divine Egyptian metal into the currency of a very human empire. The Romans used gold to pay their soldiers. This sounds obvious, but its implications were profound. A professional army of several 100,000 men stationed across the length and breadth of an empire spanning 3 continents needed to be paid regularly and reliably in a currency that was accepted everywhere. Gold coins, the aureus and later the solidus, served this function with a reliability that papyrus receipts and promises of future grain could not match. The loyalty of the Roman legions was, at a fundamental level, a function of the gold supply. When emperors could not pay their soldiers in sound gold coinage, soldiers found reasons to support different emperors. This happened with increasing frequency as the 3rd century CE progressed, and the empire entered the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome had more than 50 emperors, most of whom died violently, most of whom were proclaimed and deposed by armies that were loyal not to any abstract principle of Roman governance, but to whoever was currently capable of meeting the payroll. The emperors in this period did something that emperors and governments have been doing ever since when the gold runs short. They debased the currency. They reduced the gold content of the coins while maintaining their face value, stretching the available supply of metal further by mixing it with silver and copper, and eventually producing coins that were gold in name only, silver-washed bronze discs that retained the image of imperial authority while having almost none of its substance. The soldiers noticed. The merchants noticed. The people who received these coins in payment for goods and services noticed. The way people have always noticed when the money they are being paid is worth less than it used to be. Prices rose to compensate for the declining value of the currency. The rising prices made the soldiers demand higher pay. The higher pay required more debasement. The cycle fed itself with the remorseless logic of all monetary crises, each step making the next step more necessary and more damaging. The Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE. The causes of Rome's fall have been debated by historians for 15 centuries and will probably be debated for 15 more. And the answer is certainly not reducible to gold alone. But the gold is part of the answer. The steady drain of gold to the east, the debasement of the currency, the inability to pay and therefore to maintain the loyalty of the armies that defended the frontiers. These things form a thread that runs through the last centuries of Roman history with a consistency that is difficult to ignore. The gold did not disappear when Rome fell. It never disappears. It moved into the hands of the Germanic chieftains who had crossed the frontiers and carved up the Western Empire into kingdoms, into the treasury of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine state centered on Constantinople, which survived the fall of the West by nearly 1,000 years, partly because it maintained a sound gold currency, the solidus, with a consistency and a discipline that the Western Empire had lost. The Byzantine solidus
struck to the same weight and purity for 7 centuries, became the reserve currency of the medieval world, used in transactions from England to India, trusted everywhere because everyone knew that Byzantine gold meant what it said it meant. And while the political world was reorganizing itself around the ruins of Rome, in the laboratories and workshops of the medieval world, a different kind of obsession with gold was taking shape.
Alchemy, the desire to make gold, to transform base metals, lead or copper or iron, into the one metal that seemed to transcend the limitations of ordinary matter. The alchemists believed, with varying degrees of literal conviction and philosophical sophistication, that all metals were variations on the same fundamental substance, and that with the right knowledge and the right process, it should be possible to perfect an impure metal into gold, the way an impure soul might be perfected into something divine. This belief was not stupid, not by the standards of medieval natural philosophy, which did not have the atomic theory of matter, or the periodic table, or any of the conceptual tools that would eventually make it clear why transmutation of elements was impossible by chemical means. The alchemists were working with the best theoretical framework available to them, derived from Aristotle and elaborated by centuries of Islamic and European scholars. And within that framework, the transmutation of metals was not obviously impossible. It was just very, very difficult. The search for what they called the philosopher's stone, the substance or process that would achieve transmutation, occupied some of the finest minds in Europe and the Islamic world for centuries. Jabir ibn Hayyan, the 8th century Islamic scholar who is sometimes called the father of chemistry, conducted systematic experiments with metals and acids and salts that, while never achieving transmutation, laid the groundwork for actual chemistry. Roger Bacon in the 13th century, Ramon Lull in the 14th, Paracelsus in the 16th, Isaac Newton himself, who spent more time on alchemy than on physics, who filled notebooks with alchemical experiments and theories that his literary executors suppressed for centuries, because they were embarrassed by them. Newton, the man who described the laws of motion and gravity that govern the movement of planets, who developed calculus, who is arguably the greatest scientist in the history of Western civilization. He spent years trying to make gold. He failed. Everyone failed. The philosopher's stone was never found, because it does not exist, because the transformation of lead into gold requires not chemistry, but nuclear physics, requires the addition or removal of protons from an atomic nucleus, requires the conditions found inside stars or particle accelerators, not the conditions found in a medieval laboratory heated by a charcoal fire. But the failure was productive, enormously, consequentially productive. The instruments and techniques developed by alchemists in their pursuit of gold, the distillation apparatus and the acid synthesis, and the systematic experimental methodology and the careful record-keeping, became the foundation of modern chemistry. The science that gave us pharmaceuticals and materials science and industrial chemistry and 1,000 other things grew directly out of the attempt to do something impossible.
The world's medicine cabinets are, in a very real sense, a byproduct of the search for gold. But while the alchemists were failing in their laboratories, something was happening in the wider world that would bring more gold into circulation than any alchemical process could have produced. Something that would reshape the global economy and redraw the map of the world, and set in motion chains of consequence still running today. Someone was building ships and pointing them west. Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico in 1519 with 508 soldiers, 16 horses, and a set of priorities that he never bothered to conceal from anyone. He wanted gold. Not glory, though glory was part of it. Not God, though God was invoked constantly and sincerely by men who saw no contradiction between genuine religious conviction and the systematic destruction of everything they encountered. Gold was the primary objective, the organizing principle of the entire enterprise, the thing that justified the ships and the soldiers and the extraordinary violence that followed. The Spanish crown, which had financed the expeditions of Columbus and was now financing the conquest of the mainland, wanted a return on its investment. The return it wanted was gold. The Aztec Empire that Cortés encountered was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the world at that moment. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital built on an island in the middle of a lake where Mexico City now stands, had a population of perhaps 200,000 people, making it one of the largest cities on Earth, larger than any city in Spain, larger than London, larger than most European capitals. It had aqueducts and causeways and floating gardens, and a market that the Spanish soldiers, men who had seen the markets of Seville and Constantinople, described as the most impressive they had ever encountered. It had gold everywhere. The Aztec ruler, Moctezuma, received Cortés with a hospitality that historians have spent 5 centuries trying to explain. The Spanish were given quarters in the palace. They were fed. They were shown the city. And they were shown the treasury, the accumulated gold of generations of Aztec rulers, the ritual objects and the ornaments and the jewelry and the golden discs representing the sun that lined the walls of the temple of Huitzilopochtli. The Spanish soldiers stood in that treasury and felt something that the historical sources describe in terms that are almost identical across multiple accounts written independently by men who were there. Speechlessness, a kind of overwhelmed silence in the face of a quantity of gold that exceeded anything they had imagined finding. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was one of Cortés's soldiers and who wrote the most vivid first-hand account of the conquest, described seeing golden figures and golden jewelry and sheets of gold worked into the shapes of animals and birds, and said that he did not know how to describe what he saw because there were no words adequate to it. Cortés knew exactly what to do with what he saw. He took Moctezuma hostage. He used the Aztec ruler as a political shield while he consolidated Spanish control over the capital. He melted down the ceremonial gold objects, the intricate works of craftsmanship representing centuries of accumulated artistic tradition, into ingots. Simple rectangular bars of metal, standardized for transport and accounting, stripped of every meaning except their weight in a European monetary system that the Aztecs had never heard of. The gods became bars. The sacred became currency. The conquest was not swift or clean. There was a night in June 1520 that the Spanish called La Noche Triste, the sad night, when the Aztecs rose against their occupiers and drove them out of Tenochtitlan with enormous losses. Cortés lost much of his gold that night, soldiers drowning in the lake as they tried to flee across the causeways. Weighed down by the ingots they refused to abandon, even as the water rose around them. He came back the following year with a larger force and indigenous allies who had their own reasons to want the Aztec Empire destroyed. And this time, the conquest was total. Tenochtitlan was reduced to rubble. The Aztec Empire ended. And the systematic extraction of Mexican gold and silver began in earnest. A process that would continue for 300 years, and that transferred wealth from the Americas to Europe on a scale that had no precedent in human history. Then came Peru. Francisco Pizarro arrived on the coast of the Inca Empire in 1532 with 168 men. The Inca Empire was the largest in the Americas, stretching 4,000 miles along the spine of South America, held together by an extraordinary network of roads and administrative systems, and an army of tens of thousands. Pizarro had 168 men. By any rational military calculus, the outcome was not in question. But Pizarro had horses, which the Incas had never seen. He had steel armor and steel weapons, against which Inca weapons designed for warfare between unarmored opponents were largely ineffective. He had guns, primitive and slow to reload, but terrifying to people encountering them for the first time. And he had the extraordinary good fortune to arrive in the middle of a civil war between two rival Inca princes, which had divided and exhausted the empire at precisely the moment the Spanish appeared. He captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa at a meeting that was supposed to be peaceful, surrounding him with soldiers and killing his unarmed attendants in the thousands, while Atahualpa himself was taken alive. Atahualpa, demonstrating a grasp of what his captors actually wanted that was as clear-eyed as it was ultimately futile, offered a ransom. He would fill a room with gold. The room was 22 feet long and 17 feet wide. He would fill it to a line marked on the wall, as high as a man could reach with his arm extended above his head. He would fill it once with gold and twice with silver. It took 8 months. The Incas stripped the gold from the temples and the palaces and the sacred sites across the empire and carried it to Cajamarca, and the room was filled, and then filled again with silver, and then filled again. The total was staggering. 13,000 pounds of gold, 26,000 pounds of silver, melted down into ingots and distributed among the Spanish soldiers, with the crown's share set aside in the form of the Quinto Real, the royal fifth, the 20% tax on all New World treasure that financed the Spanish Empire for the next 2 centuries. Pizarro took the gold and executed Atahualpa anyway. The Spanish did not see the contradiction, or they saw it and did not care. The logic of conquest does not require moral consistency. It requires only that the conquistadors have the weapons and the will and the absence of any external force capable of stopping them. And in the Americas of the 16th century, they had all three. The gold and silver that poured from the Americas into Spain across the 16th and 17th centuries was of a quantity that transformed the European economy in ways that the Spanish themselves did not fully understand and could not control. So much metal entered circulation so quickly that prices across Europe rose dramatically. Inflation, driven by the sudden massive increase in the money supply, eroded the purchasing power of the Spanish treasure almost as fast as it arrived. Spain, which should have become permanently the wealthiest nation in Europe, instead found itself perpetually short of money, despite receiving more of it than any nation in history. Because money spent faster than it accumulated, because the wars required to maintain the empire consumed the treasure required to pay for them, because the inflation generated by the treasure undermined the domestic economy that the treasure was supposed to enrich. The gold moved through Spain and into the hands of the German and Italian bankers who financed the Spanish crown's endless wars. The Fugger family of Augsburg, the greatest banking dynasty of the 16th century, became fabulously wealthy, financing the Habsburgs against the profits of American gold that had not yet arrived. The gold arrived. It paid the debts, and then more debts were incurred against the next shipment and the next, in a cycle that made the bankers enormously wealthy and left Spain, despite its empire, chronically indebted. The people who got richest from American gold were often not the Spanish. They were never the Aztecs or the Incas, and they were certainly not the millions of indigenous Americans who died in the decades following the conquest, killed by warfare and forced labor, and, most devastatingly, by the diseases that the Spanish brought with them inadvertently. Smallpox and measles and typhus swept through populations that had no immunity to old world diseases, with a speed and a thoroughness that reduced the indigenous population of the Americas by an estimated 90% within a century of contact. 90%. The gold was extracted from a dying world, carried across an ocean, melted and reminted and spent and borrowed against and inflated away, flowing through the arteries of the European economy like blood through a body that was itself being transformed by the transfusion. The world after American gold was not the same world as before it. The center of gravity of global trade shifted. The Atlantic replaced the Mediterranean as the primary arena of European commerce and power. The nations that could project power across the Atlantic, Spain and Portugal first, then the Netherlands and England and France, became the dominant powers of the modern era. All of it downstream from a room in Cajamarca filled with gold by a man who thought it would save his life. It did not save his life, but it changed the world. On the morning of January 24th, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall was inspecting a water channel at a sawmill being built on the American River in California, and he saw something gleaming at the bottom of the channel that stopped him where he stood. He picked it up. He bit it, the way people tested metal in that era, because gold is soft enough to show tooth marks, and most other metals are not. He weighed it on improvised scales made from his pocket balance. He hammered it, because gold is malleable, and most other metals at that size would crack or shatter. It did not crack. He walked to find his employer, John Sutter, and showed him what he had found. And both men understood immediately what it meant. And both men wanted desperately to keep it secret. Sutter had a carefully constructed agricultural empire in the Sacramento Valley, and he understood, with a clarity that events would prove entirely correct, that the discovery of gold on his land would not make him rich. It would make him irrelevant. It would bring thousands of people onto his land who would not ask his permission and could not be stopped, who would trample his crops and slaughter his cattle and dismantle everything he had built in the pursuit of something that made farming look like slow and modest work. The secret lasted approximately 3 weeks. By the summer of 1848, word had spread through California. By the fall, it had reached the east coast of the United States. By December, President James Polk had confirmed the discovery in his annual message to Congress, and the information that had been rumor and speculation became official, and the largest voluntary mass migration in American history began. 100,000 people arrived in California in 1849. That is where the name comes from, the 49ers. They came by ship around Cape Horn, a journey of 5 to 8 months through some of the most dangerous waters on Earth. They came across the Isthmus of Panama, a shorter route, but one that passed through malarial jungle, where a significant percentage of travelers died before reaching the Pacific. They came overland across the continent, across prairies and deserts and mountain ranges, in wagon trains that set out in spring to beat the winter snows and sometimes did not make it. They came from everywhere, from the eastern United States and from Europe and from China and from Chile and from Australia and from Mexico. California in 1849 became one of the most ethnically diverse places on Earth almost overnight, a fact that sat in considerable tension with the racial attitudes of the era and produced violence and legal discrimination and the particular cruelty that frightened people direct at those they perceive as competition. What they found when they got there was both more and less than they had imagined. The gold was real. The California goldfields contained enormous quantities of it, more than had been found in any single location since the Spanish stripped the Americas 3 centuries earlier. In 1848, the year of the discovery, approximately $10 million worth of gold was extracted from California. In 1852, the peak year, it was $81 million. In today's terms, billions. But the distribution of that gold was not what the 49ers had imagined when they sold their farms and their businesses and their furniture and bought a passage west. The men who got rich in the California gold rush were, with some exceptions, not the miners. They were the people who sold things to the miners, The merchants and the hoteliers and the laundresses and the saloon keepers and the men who sold shovels and picks and pans at prices that reflected the fact that in a gold rush, the scarcest commodity is not gold, but everything else. Levi Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853, intending to sell dry goods to miners. He noticed that miners needed pants that could withstand the brutal physical demands of placer mining, and he began making pants from denim reinforced with copper rivets at the stress points. He got rich. The miners who wore his pants mostly did not. A young merchant named Philip Armour made enough money in California selling provisions to miners to fund the meatpacking business that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest men in America. John Studebaker, later famous for automobiles, made his first money building wheelbarrows for California miners. The gold rush made fortunes, but most of those fortunes were made at one remove from the gold itself. John Sutter, whose land the gold was found on, died broke. His workers abandoned him for the gold fields. Squatters took his land. His legal claims were disputed and eventually denied. The discovery that should have made him the richest man in California destroyed everything he had. James Marshall, who found the first gold, died in 1885 in poverty, supporting himself in his last years by selling his autograph to tourists who wanted a souvenir of the man who had started it all. Gold is like that. It promises everything and delivers to a very specific and unpredictable set of people, and they are rarely the people who do the actual finding. But the California gold rush did something beyond enriching merchants and ruining miners. It accelerated the development of the American West by decades. California, which had a non-indigenous population of perhaps 14,000 in 1848, had 300,000 by 1855, and became a state in 1850, less than 2 years after the discovery, bypassing the territorial phase that every previous state had gone through. The infrastructure built to supply the gold rush, the roads and the ships, and eventually the telegraph lines and the railroads, became the infrastructure of a continental economy. And the gold itself, the hundreds of millions of dollars worth of California gold that flowed into the American economy in the 1850s, fueled an economic expansion that transformed the United States from a regional power into the beginning of a global one. It also intensified a debate that had been running through economic thought for centuries, and that the sudden massive increase in the gold supply made suddenly urgent. What should money be? The gold standard, the system by which a currency is directly linked to a fixed quantity of gold, had been developing in Britain through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and had become, by the mid-19th century, the dominant monetary framework of the industrialized world. The logic was simple and appealing. If every unit of currency represents a fixed amount of gold held in reserve, then the currency cannot be inflated arbitrarily. Governments cannot print money they do not have. The supply of money is limited by the supply of gold, which is limited by what can be physically extracted from the earth, which provides a natural brake on the kind of monetary excess that had destroyed currencies and economies throughout history. The gold standard made international trade easier.
When every major currency was convertible to gold at a fixed rate, exchange rates were stable and predictable in a way that made long-term international contracts and investments possible. The period from roughly 1870 to 1914, when the gold standard was at its peak and most of the major economies of the world were on it simultaneously, was a period of extraordinary growth in international trade and investment, the first era of genuine economic globalization. It also made monetary policy nearly impossible. When an economy contracted, when unemployment rose and businesses failed, and the normal mechanisms of a capitalist economy went into their periodic downward spiral, a government on the gold standard had very limited tools for responding. It could not increase the money supply to stimulate demand, because the money supply was tied to the gold supply, and gold did not increase just because the economy needed it to. It could not lower interest rates below what the maintenance of the gold peg required. It was, in a sense, a passenger in its own economy, bound by the constraints of a metal whose supply was determined by geology and mining technology, rather than by the needs of the human beings the economy was supposed to serve. This tension exploded into American politics in the 1890s with a ferocity that seems almost incomprehensible today. The Depression of the 1890s devastated American farmers and workers, while leaving the financial establishment, which favored the gold standard, largely intact. The populist movement that arose in response demanded the monetization of silver, the expansion of the money supply through the addition of silver to the monetary base, in terms so passionate and so apocalyptic that the era's political rhetoric sounds more like religious warfare than economic policy debate. William Jennings Bryan, accepting the Democratic presidential nomination in 1896, delivered a speech that ended with a sentence that became one of the most famous in American political history. "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Bryan lost. The gold standard survived. But the argument he was making, that a monetary system should serve the needs of the people who live within it, rather than the constraints of a particular metal, was an argument that would eventually win. It won in stages. The First World War forced most countries off the gold standard temporarily, as they printed money to finance the fighting. The attempt to return to gold in the 1920s at pre-war parities contributed to the deflationary pressures that turned the financial crisis of 1929 into the Great Depression. Country after country abandoned gold through the 1930s as the choice became clear: stay on gold and watch the economy collapse. Leave gold and recover. Britain left in 1931. The United States left domestically in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt banned private gold ownership and devalued the dollar against gold. A modified gold standard, the Bretton Woods system established after the Second World War, in which other currencies were pegged to the dollar, and the dollar alone was convertible to gold at $35 an ounce, lasted until 1971.
On August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon appeared on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold at a fixed rate. The last link between the world's dominant currency and the metal that had defined money for 3,000 years was severed. The gold standard was over. Money became, officially and completely, whatever governments said it was. A promise, an agreement, a collective act of faith in institutions and systems rather than in a metal sitting in a vault. The gold is still in the vault. It has not changed. But its relationship to the world of human exchange, the relationship that had defined it since the first Lydian coins were struck 2,700 years ago, had been permanently altered. Gold was no longer money. It was something else, something harder to define, a store of value and a hedge against uncertainty, and a safe harbor in times of crisis, and a commodity, and an investment, and a symbol. Always a symbol of something permanent in a world that keeps changing, of something real in a world that keeps becoming more abstract. The vaults beneath Manhattan are still full of it. And somewhere in a California riverbed, in the gravel at the bottom of a cold mountain stream, there is still gold that nobody has found yet, waiting, the way it has always waited, with the patience of something that knows it will outlast whatever comes looking for it. There is gold in your pocket right now. Not in your wallet, not in your jewelry, in your phone. The smartphone that you carry everywhere, that you probably looked at within the last hour, that contains more computing power than all of NASA had when it put men on the moon, contains approximately 30 milligrams of gold. 30 milligrams is not much. It is invisible to the naked eye, spread across the circuit boards and connectors and chips in a layer so thin it would take a microscope to see it clearly. But there are 8 billion smartphones in the world. 8 billion times 30 milligrams is 240,000 kilograms of gold. Nearly 250,000 kilograms sitting in pockets and purses and desk drawers and kitchen counters across the planet, doing the work that gold has always been uniquely suited to do. Conducting electricity with perfect reliability, resisting corrosion in environments where any other metal would eventually fail, connecting the microscopic components of the most complex machines human beings have ever built with a consistency that the entire digital world depends on. Gold is in your phone because there is no substitute for it. Engineers have tried. The semiconductor industry has spent decades and billions of dollars looking for materials that can do what gold does in electronic applications at a lower cost. Some substitutes work in some applications. None work in all of them. Gold remains, in the 21st century as in the ancient world, irreplaceable. The gold in your phone is part of a story that began in the hearts of dead stars and passed through the hands of Egyptian pharaohs and Aztec priests and California prospectors and Wall Street bankers,
and is now carrying the text messages and the photographs and the search queries of 8 billion human beings living their daily lives in a world so thoroughly shaped by this metal that most of them never think about it at all. This is what full circle looks like.
But the story does not stop at your phone. It goes further. It goes up. NASA coats the visors of astronaut helmets with a thin film of gold because nothing else reflects infrared radiation as effectively, protecting the astronauts' eyes from the unfiltered solar radiation of space. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021 and now providing the deepest and most detailed images of the universe ever captured, has its primary mirror coated in gold. The mirror that is showing us galaxies formed 300 million years after the Big Bang. The mirror that is pushing the boundaries of human knowledge further than any instrument before it, works because of a layer of gold atoms 100 nanometers thick applied to its surface. Gold, forged in the collision of neutron stars billions of years ago, is being used to look at the universe that made it. There is a poetry in this that no human writer invented. It was always there, waiting in the physics and the chemistry and the long, improbable chain of events that connected a stellar explosion to a telescope mirror to the image of a galaxy so old that the light reaching us left it before the Earth existed. And there is more gold out there, much more. The asteroids of the inner solar system contain quantities of gold and other precious metals that make every deposit ever mined on Earth look modest. The asteroid 16 Psyche, a metallic asteroid in the main asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, is estimated to contain enough iron and nickel and gold and platinum to be worth, by some calculations, $10,000 quadrillion. A number so large that if it were actually brought to Earth and sold, it would not make everyone on the planet rich. It would collapse the price of metal entirely, rendering the gold worthless by the simple logic of supply and demand. NASA launched a mission to 16 Psyche in October 2023, not to mine it, to study it, to understand what a metallic asteroid can tell us about the formation of planetary cores and the early solar system. But the mining will come. Not soon, not within any time frame that affects the lives of anyone alive today, but eventually. The economics of space mining will eventually become favorable, and when they do, the supply of gold available to human civilization will increase by orders of magnitude. What happens to gold then is genuinely uncertain. The properties that make it useful, its conductivity, its corrosion resistance, its reflectivity, will not change. The properties that make it beautiful will not change. But the scarcity that has underpinned its monetary value for 3,000 years, the geological limitation that meant only a certain amount could be extracted from the Earth in any given period, will be gone. Will it still mean what it has always meant? That is a question about human psychology more than economics. And the answer, if history is any guide, is probably yes. Because the meaning of gold was never really about scarcity. Scarcity reinforced the meaning
but did not create it. The meaning was always about permanence, about the desire for something that does not change in a world where everything changes, about the particular human need to hold in your hand something that was here before you and will be here after you, and connects you tangibly and physically to everything that came before. That need does not go away when the supply increases. It is not a need that can be satisfied by abundance. It is a need that comes from something deeper than economics, from the awareness of mortality that has been the defining feature of human consciousness since the first human being understood that they would die. Cultures that have never traded with each other arrived at gold independently. Cultures separated by oceans and millennia, and every conceivable difference in language and religion and social organization, looked at this soft yellow metal and felt the same thing. Not the same economic calculation, the same feeling. The feeling that this was different, that this was outside the normal flow of things, that this was something that could be trusted to remain. There is a piece of gold jewelry in the National Museum of Iraq, recovered from the royal tombs of Ur, dating to approximately 2600 BCE. It is a headdress made of beaten gold leaves and gold ribbons, worn by a woman buried with the kind of ceremony reserved for people of the highest status. The woman's name is not known. Her face is not known. Almost nothing about her life is known. But the gold headdress she wore in death is still here, 4,600 years later. Still the same warm yellow, still catching the light the way gold has always caught the light. Somewhere in the soil of Bulgaria, in the region around the Varna necropolis, where the oldest worked gold in the world was found, there is almost certainly more gold waiting to be discovered. Objects placed in graves 6,000 years ago by people whose names and language and beliefs are entirely lost to us, preserved perfectly in the darkness, because gold does not decay, because gold was never going to decay, because the people who placed it there understood something true about this metal, even if they did not understand the quantum mechanics behind its color, or the neutron-star collision that forged its atoms. They understood that it would last. They were right. The gold beneath the streets of Manhattan has been there since the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was built in the 1920s. Some of it has been there longer, moved from vault to vault across centuries, changing hands and changing meanings, but never changing composition. It sits in the dark, in stacks of bars, each weighing 27 pounds, in a room excavated from the bedrock of Manhattan Island, 50 feet below sea level, guarded by a door that weighs 90 tons and is sealed by a mechanism that requires multiple people turning multiple keys simultaneously. It does nothing. It generates no income. It produces no goods or services. By the logic of modern finance, it is profoundly inefficient, a dead asset consuming real resources in security and maintenance while sitting idle. And yet, every major government on Earth maintains gold reserves. Every central bank holds gold. In times of crisis, when currencies collapse and financial systems fail, and the elaborate architecture of modern money reveals itself as the collective agreement it has always been, people reach for gold. In Venezuela during the hyperinflation of the 2000s, in Zimbabwe during the collapse of the Zimbabwean dollar, in Weimar Germany a century ago, in every monetary crisis in recorded history, the response is the same. People reach for gold. Because it is the thing that has always been there. The thing that was here before the current system and will be here after it. The thing that connects the person holding it now to every person who has ever held it across the entire span of human civilization. You are part of that chain. The atoms in the gold that exists in your world, in your phone, and in the jewelry in your house, and in the vaults of the banks that underpin the economy you live in, those atoms were forged before the Earth existed. They fell to Earth in asteroids billions of years ago. They sat in riverbeds and were picked up by human hands and passed from person to person across millennia, melted and recast and reminted and reformed, but never destroyed, never diminished, always and irrevocably gold. The Pharaoh's gold, and the conquistadors' gold, and the 49ers' gold, and the gold in your pocket right now are made of the same atoms that have been cycling through human history since before history began. Nothing has been added. Nothing has been lost. Close your eyes. Somewhere in the dark, in a vault you will never see, in a riverbed you will never visit, in the circuit board of a device in your hand, in the mirror of a telescope pointed at the edge of the observable universe, the gold is there, gleaming, unchanged, waiting with the patience of something forged in the death of stars, and destined to outlast everything that has ever wanted it. Which is everything. Which is everyone. Which is you. Sleep well.